The first thing I noticed was that my father never touched the champagne. Not during the rehearsal dinner, not during the speeches, not even when everyone else raised their glasses beneath the gold chandelier while the violin quartet played soft music, expensive enough to sound emotionless. He only held the glass, carefully, like it belonged to someone else. And that bothered me more than it should have, because Richard Vale never did anything accidentally. Not the smile he wore in public, not the stories he told investors, not the way he controlled every room without raising his voice, and definitely not the way his fingers slowly switched our champagne glasses seconds before the toast began. No one else noticed it, not my fiancé, not the guests, not the senator laughing beside the stage, not even the photographer standing 6 feet away. But I noticed, because growing up as Richard Vale's daughter taught me one thing very early. Survival lives in details. My father lifted the wrong glass, then slid mine half an inch to the left. Smooth, practiced, invisible, except to me. For a second, I simply stared at him. The ballroom lights reflected against the crystal rims while violin conversations blurred into background noise. My father looked directly at me and smiled, not warmly, not proudly, strategically. The same smile he wore the day he convinced my mother to sign away her shares before the divorce. The same smile he wore outside the courthouse after bankrupting his own brother. The same smile he wore every time someone underestimated how dangerous he could become when money was involved. Then he raised the glass toward me slightly, a silent invitation. Drink. My fingers tightened around the sealed envelope resting beneath the table. Thick cream paper, my name written in black ink, and inside it, the one thing my father never expected me to have. Across the ballroom, my younger sister Vanessa laughed too loudly at something one of the board members said. Perfect dress, perfect posture, perfect daughter. She had spent her entire life learning how to orbit our father like a loyal moon, and tonight she looked happy. Not wedding happy, victorious happy. That was the difference. I slowly lifted the champagne glass, not the original one, the switched one. My father watched carefully, too carefully. And that was when I knew. Whatever was happening tonight had already started long before I arrived. The music softened. Conversations faded. My fiancé Ethan placed a gentle hand against my back. "You okay?" he whispered. I looked at him. Honest eyes. Steady voice. A man who still believed wealthy families solved problems through conversations instead of destruction. I almost envied him. "Perfect," I said calmly. The lie came naturally. It always did around my family. My father stepped toward the center microphone. The room adjusted instantly. Power has gravity, and Richard Vale carried enough of it to bend entire rooms around him. "Tonight," he began smoothly, "is about legacy." There it was. Legacy. His favorite word. He used it whenever he wanted to disguise control as love. The guests smiled politely. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. Servers moved quietly through the ballroom carrying silver trays worth more than most people's cars. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked safe. That's the terrifying thing about wealthy families. The knives are usually hidden beneath silk. My father continued speaking while slowly pacing beside the table. "When your children grow up," he said, "you hope they understand sacrifice, responsibility, family." Vanessa nodded beside him. My mother lowered her eyes. And me? I watched his hand, because he still hadn't touched the champagne. Not once. My pulse slowed instead of rising. That always happened when situations turn dangerous. People think fear creates panic. It doesn't. Real danger creates clarity. My father finally looked directly at me. "Some children," he continued carefully, "honor what they're given." A pause. "Others spend their lives fighting the people trying to help them." There it was. The public setup. The beginning of the performance. Around the ballroom, several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. They knew enough about our family to sense tension, but not enough to understand it. Ethan shifted beside me. "Claire, what's happening?" he whispered. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, I still wasn't completely sure. I only knew 3 things. My father switched our glasses. He wanted me to drink, and he was pretending not to. That combination alone was enough to make my stomach turn cold. Then Vanessa stood. "Dad," she said softly, smiling at the guests, "maybe tonight should stay positive." The room relaxed slightly. Perfect Vanessa, always rescuing situations at exactly the right moment. My father smiled proudly at her. "Of course," he said. But his eyes never left mine. Not once. Then he lifted his glass. Finally. The room followed. Hundreds of crystal glasses rose together beneath golden light. "To family," he said. The guests echoed it. "To family." I looked at the champagne. Tiny bubbles climbing silently toward the surface. My father waited. The room waited. And suddenly I remembered something. 10 years earlier, rain hammering against hospital windows, my mother crying quietly outside an ICU room, and my father signing financial documents before speaking to the surgeon. I was 19. Vanessa was 16. Our grandfather had suffered a stroke. The doctor said immediate treatment could save him, but the treatment would delay a merger my father had spent months arranging. So he waited. Not long, only 6 hours. Just enough. Grandfather survived, but he never spoke again. And 6 months later, control of the family company transferred entirely to my father. I remember confronting him afterwards. I remember standing inside his office, shaking with rage. "How could you do that?" I asked. He looked at me calmly from behind his desk, then said something I never forgot. "Emotions are expensive, Claire. Never let them cost you leverage." That was the moment I stopped seeing him as a father and started seeing him as something else, something colder, something that measured human value in percentages. Back in the ballroom, my father still held the champagne toward me, waiting, testing. I smiled softly, then lowered the glass without drinking. Very small movement, very polite, but his expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough. A crack, a single fracture beneath decades of practiced control. "Claire," he said lightly. The room looked toward me. I met his gaze. "Before the toast," I said calmly, "I actually brought something for you." Silence. Tiny. Curious. I slowly lifted the envelope from beneath the table, and for the first time that night, my father stopped pretending to smile. The shift was immediate, subtle to everyone else, obvious to me. His shoulders tightened almost invisibly. Vanessa noticed it too. Her eyes flicked from the envelope to my face, then back again. "What's that?" she asked carefully. I didn't answer her. I only looked at my father. Because this moment wasn't about curiosity. It was about recognition. And he already recognized it. The cream paper, the black seal, the handwriting. He knew exactly where it came from. The room waited. Ethan looked confused beside me. My mother looked nervous. But my father? He looked afraid. Not publicly, not openly. Richard Vale would rather bleed than show fear in front of people. But I saw it, because daughters learn the faces fathers hide from the world. "Claire," he said softly, "this isn't the time." That sentence alone almost made me laugh. Not the time, as if timing had ever mattered to him when destroying someone. I stood slowly from my chair. Every eye in the ballroom followed. The violinists stopped playing, and suddenly the room felt smaller, like all the oxygen had quietly disappeared. "I think," I said calmly, "it's exactly the time." Vanessa stepped closer to our father, protective, instinctive. She always moved toward power, even as a child, especially as a child. When we were young, she used to stand beside my father during arguments and repeat his opinions back to him, almost word for word. At first I thought she admired him. Later I realized something worse. She feared becoming invisible, the way he made everyone invisible eventually, even our mother, especially our mother. My father slowly set his untouched champagne glass down, carefully, again, without drinking. That detail kept pulling at me, like a thread unraveling something larger. "What's in the envelope?" Ethan asked quietly. I turned slightly toward him, and for a second, I almost hated myself, because he didn't belong inside this war. He came from normal people, teachers, simple birthdays, arguments that ended with apologies instead of lawsuits. He still believed families could heal. My family preferred negotiations, or casualties. I touched his hand gently. "Something overdue," I said. My father stepped away from the microphone. "No," he said quietly. The single word stopped the room harder than shouting would have, because powerful men only lower their voices when they're losing control. I watched him carefully. Then finally understood something. The champagne switch wasn't the plan, it was the backup plan. That realization hit me slowly, like ice water filling lungs. My father believed the envelope could destroy something, which meant whatever was inside frightened him more than public humiliation. Vanessa stood next. "Claire," she said carefully, "whatever this is, don't do this here." I looked at her. Beautiful, controlled, expensive, and somehow still desperate for our father's approval after 30 years. "You already know what it is, don't you?" I asked. Her expression froze. Only briefly, but enough. And suddenly, every memory rearranged itself. The rushed engagement dinner, the sudden pressure to sign estate revisions, the family lawyer calling me 3 times that week, my father insisting we combine assets before the wedding, the strange urgency behind every conversation. They weren't organizing a celebration. They were preparing an extraction. Money, control, inheritance. Always inheritance. The guests looked increasingly uncomfortable now. The silence after my question felt unnatural. Not shocked, not loud, controlled. Like the entire ballroom had suddenly remembered how expensive the people inside it were. My father didn't answer immediately. That mattered, because innocent people react fast to accusations. Dangerous people calculate first. Richard Vale stared at me across the white cloth table while crystal chandeliers scattered gold light across the ballroom ceiling. His expression stayed composed, mostly, but his eyes had changed. Not panic, worse, assessment. He was measuring damage. Vanessa recovered first. Of course she did. She stepped forward sharply, voice tight with disbelief. "Claire, stop it!" Interesting. Not, "What are you talking about?" Not, "That's insane." Just, "Stop it." As if the danger wasn't the accusation, it was me saying it out loud. I kept my gaze on my father. "You switched the glasses," I said calmly. Several guests lowered their drinks immediately. Subtle movement, very human. My father noticed it too, which meant the room was already slipping away from him. "Careful," he said quietly. There it was again. No denial, only control. My pulse remained perfectly steady. That always happened during dangerous moments. People think calm is confidence. It isn't. Sometimes calm is recognition, and I recognize this version of my father very well. The version that appeared right before he destroyed someone. Ethan stepped closer beside me. "Claire," he whispered, "tell me what's going on." I almost looked at him. Almost. But I couldn't afford softness right now. Not in this room, not with my father watching every reaction like a chess player studying angles. "I'm figuring that out myself," I said. Arthur Bennett adjusted his cuff slowly near the back tables. Tiny gesture, nervous. That terrified me more than anything else so far, because Arthur had spent 40 years protecting powerful people during ugly situations, divorces, fraud investigations, political scandals, deaths, and this was the first time I had ever seen his hands shake. My father finally smiled again, small, controlled, artificial. "Everyone," he said smoothly, addressing the ballroom, "I think emotions are getting the better of my daughter tonight." Classic. Reduce the woman, question stability, protect the narrative. Half the room visibly wanted to believe him, because wealthy people prefer comfortable lies over dangerous truths, especially at weddings. I tilted my head slightly. Then, "Drink it." Silence. Immediate. Sharp. The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were loud, because they were simple. My father's smile disappeared completely. Ethan looked between us. Vanessa inhaled slowly, and my mother looked like she might faint. Richard Vale folded his hands carefully in front of him. Another control gesture, another delay. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said quietly. I nodded once. Then prove me wrong. The ballroom had fully split now. Some guests leaned forward, others avoided eye contact completely. Nobody left. Nobody wealthy ever leaves before the truth arrives. My father glanced toward Arthur. Very fast, very small, but enough. Arthur looked away immediately, and there it was, confirmation. Not legal confirmation, human confirmation. Fear. I felt Ethan's hand touch my elbow gently. "Claire," he said carefully, "if you really think something's wrong, we should call the police." Vanessa reacted instantly. "No." Too fast. Way too fast. Every instinct inside me sharpened immediately, because innocent people welcome investigations. Only guilty people fear timelines. Vanessa realized her mistake half a second too late. I mean, let's not make this public before we know anything. Public. Interesting word choice. Not before we panic, not before we overreact, before we make it public, meaning reputation mattered more than danger, exactly like my father taught her. I slowly picked up the champagne glass again, the switched one. The room tracked the movement collectively. My father's jaw tightened instantly. There. That reaction, that tiny fracture beneath decades of discipline. "You shouldn't do that," he said. Finally. Not "you're imagining things," not "nothing's wrong," just "you shouldn't do that." My fingers rested lightly against the crystal stem. Cold, elegant, possibly lethal. And suddenly I realized something horrifying. My father wasn't scared I would expose him. He was scared I might accidentally drink the wrong glass now, which meant one possibility had become unavoidable. He no longer knew which glass contained the poison. The realization moved through me slowly, cleanly, like a blade sliding between ribs. Because somewhere during the switch, something had gone wrong. I looked at the two champagne glasses sitting side by side beneath chandelier light. Identical, perfect, deadly. My father saw the realization hit me, and for the first time in my entire life, Richard Vale looked uncertain. Only briefly, but enough. Ethan followed my eyes toward the glasses, then slowly stepped backwards. "Oh my God," he whispered. Vanessa's composure finally cracked. "Dad." Not angry, afraid. My father ignored her completely. His attention stayed locked on me. "Put the glass down," he said quietly. Authority filled the sentence automatically. Decades of controlling rooms, board meetings, courtrooms, family. But something had changed. For the first time, I wasn't responding like his daughter anymore. I was responding like a threat. I smiled slightly. "You first." Another silence, this one worse, because now everyone understood the same thing simultaneously. Neither of us trusted the champagne. Around the ballroom, people slowly began setting their glasses down, one by one, soft crystal touches against white tablecloths, like tiny surrender flags. Arthur stepped forward again. "Richard, this has gone far enough." My father didn't even look at him. "Stay out of this." Arthur's expression hardened slightly. Interesting, very interesting, because men like Arthur Bennett didn't tolerate being spoken to like employees, not unless the situation was catastrophic. I watched my father carefully, and then asked the question that had been building quietly inside me since the envelope appeared. Did grandmother know? That hit him. Hard. Not visibly to most people, but I knew his tells. His left hand flexed once against the table edge, the same movement he made outside the courthouse 20 years ago, after losing the only case of his career. Vanessa looked genuinely confused now. What does grandmother have to do with this? I turned toward her slowly, and suddenly I understood something terrible. She didn't know everything. She knew enough to participate, enough to stay loyal, enough to help, but not enough to see the entire machine. My father compartmentalized people, even family, especially family. "Ask him," I said softly. Vanessa looked toward our father, for the first time that night, not with loyalty, with uncertainty, and Richard Vale noticed immediately. That was the first moment he actually lost control of the room. Not when I accused him, not when the guests started whispering, not even when the word poison entered the ballroom. No, it happened when Vanessa took half a step away from him. Very small movement, very polite, but power notices distance instantly, especially men addicted to obedience. My father looked at her, then at me, then finally at the envelope still resting in my hand, and when he spoke again, his voice sounded colder than I had ever heard it before.
You should have drank the champagne before opening that envelope.
You should have drank the champagne before opening that envelope. Nobody moved after he said it. Not immediately. The ballroom stayed suspended in one impossible moment while hundreds of wealthy strangers silently tried to decide whether they had just witnessed a threat or a confession. Ethan looked at me first, then at the champagne, then back at my father. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked. My father didn't answer him. That mattered, because Richard Vale never ignored questions unless the truthful answer was dangerous. Vanessa stepped closer to him again, visibly shaken now. "Dad," she whispered, "tell me you didn't." Enough. The word cut through the ballroom instantly, sharp, controlled, final. Vanessa stopped talking, not because she agreed with him, because years of conditioning still lived inside her nervous system. I knew the feeling. My father slowly adjusted the cuff of his jacket and looked around the room with terrifying calm. And suddenly I understood why people trusted men like him. Not because they seemed kind, because they seemed composed. Even now, even here, especially here. "We're having a misunderstanding," he said smoothly. The room wanted that sentence desperately. You could feel it. People nodded slightly, some relaxed, because wealthy people are trained to protect comfort before truth. Arthur Bennett didn't relax. He looked directly at the champagne glasses, then at me. "Claire," he said carefully, "set the glass down." There was genuine urgency in his voice now. That changed something inside me. Arthur wasn't protecting reputation anymore. He was protecting survival. I lowered the glass slowly onto the tablecloth. Across from me, my father finally exhaled. Tiny movement, almost invisible, but I saw it. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Richard Vale had been afraid, not of scandal, not of exposure, of uncertainty. He didn't know where the poison was anymore. Ethan stepped in front of me instinctively, protective, human, completely out of place inside my family. "Someone call the police," he said. Several guests immediately pulled out phones. My father reacted instantly. No. Too fast again. Too emotional. And the room felt it this time. The balance was shifting now. Not publicly, psychologically. People were beginning to reassess him in real time. That's the dangerous thing about power. Once doubt enters the room, authority starts bleeding from invisible wounds. My father noticed it immediately, which meant he was becoming dangerous. His voice softened, a terrible sign. "Think carefully before you overreact," he said quietly. "A public accusation like this destroys lives." Interesting choice of words. Not, "this is insane," not, "there's no poison," just, "a public accusation destroys lives." I looked at him steadily. So does poison. The ballroom went silent again. Somewhere near the back tables, a woman quietly set down her champagne flute without taking another sip. Then another guest did the same. Then another. A chain reaction. Fear spreading through crystal. Vanessa suddenly looked around the room in horror. "Oh my God," she whispered, because she finally understood the real problem. Nobody knew which glasses were safe anymore. The servers, the guests, the table arrangements, everything had blurred together during the toast. My father realized it too. For the first time all night, his composure cracked visibly. Very slightly, but enough. Arthur moved immediately. "No one drinks anything," he announced sharply. That changed the atmosphere instantly. Now it sounded official, real. Panic began moving quietly through the ballroom. Not screaming, not chaos. Something colder, controlled fear. The kind wealthy people show when they know witnesses exist. Ethan grabbed my arm gently. "We need to leave," he said. But I didn't move, because another realization had just arrived. Slow, heavy, precise. The poison wasn't meant to kill me publicly. That would be messy, investigated, uncontrollable. No, if my father poisoned the champagne, then the real plan was simpler. Make me collapse later, privately, away from witnesses. And suddenly, every rushed signature request from the past month rearranged itself inside my head. The estate revisions, the asset transfers, the pressure to finalize the marriage agreement. They weren't preparing for a wedding. They were preparing for an inheritance event. Vanessa looked toward me slowly. "What was in the envelope?" she asked quietly. I studied her face carefully, and for the first time in years, I saw something beneath the perfection.
Not manipulation. Fear. Real fear. Because whatever role she played in this family machine, she hadn't expected this. I held up the envelope slightly. My grandmother changed the estate before she died. Whispers exploded instantly across the ballroom. My father closed his eyes briefly. Tiny movement, but devastating, because guilty people get tired, especially when the truth starts multiplying faster than the lies controlling it. Arthur looked furious now, actually furious. "You told me she destroyed the original amendment," he said sharply, to my father. The room froze. There it was, the first direct fracture, not from me, from his own ally. My father turned slowly toward Arthur, and the expression on his face made my stomach turn cold. No anger, no embarrassment, calculation, pure calculation, like he was already deciding who needed to be sacrificed next. "You should leave," he said quietly to Arthur. Arthur stared at him in disbelief. Then something unexpected happened. My mother spoke. "You killed her, didn't you?" The sentence barely sounded real, soft, broken, but somehow louder than anything else that night. My father looked at her slowly. 28 years of marriage stood silently between them. Charities, galas, vacations, photographs, performances. And underneath it all, something rotten enough to survive decades unnoticed. "Margaret," he said calmly, "don't be ridiculous." But she already knew. I could see it happening behind her eyes. Not realization, recognition. Like she spent years collecting tiny pieces of horror and finally found the shape they belonged to. Vanessa stepped backward from our father. One step, then another, and suddenly Richard Vale was standing alone in the center of the ballroom he spent 20 years controlling. That changed him. Immediately. Because men like my father can survive hatred, but not isolation. His voice lost warmth completely. "If any of you walk this situation into a courtroom, you will regret it." No one spoke, no one moved, and somehow that made the threat worse. Then Ethan did something brave, or stupid, maybe both. He stepped beside me fully and looked directly at my father. "She's not staying here tonight." My father stared at him for a long moment, almost curious, like he had just discovered Ethan possessed a spine. Then he smiled, cold, polite, predatory. "You think this ends when you leave the ballroom?" he asked softly. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. The envelope wasn't the real secret. It was only the beginning of it.
Nobody answered him after that. Not because we were afraid to speak, because everyone suddenly understood the same thing at once. This wasn't family drama anymore. It was containment. My father stood beneath the chandelier light with one hand resting lightly against the back of a gold-trimmed chair, perfectly composed again. Too composed. That was always the danger with him. Richard Vale only became calm when he had already started planning collateral damage. The ballroom staff had stopped moving entirely now. Servers frozen beside silver trays, musicians standing silently near the stage. Even the investors looked trapped between curiosity and survival instinct. Nobody wanted to leave first because the first person to leave a powerful man's collapse becomes visible, and visible people become targets. Ethan kept one arm slightly in front of me, protective without performing it. I noticed my father watching that carefully, evaluating him, measuring usefulness, threat, weakness. That frightened me more than the poison, because my father rarely hated people emotionally. He categorized them strategically. "Claire," my mother said softly, "what exactly was in Eleanor's letter?" Her voice shook near the end, not dramatically, just enough. I looked down at the envelope still resting in my hand. Cream paper, black seal. 3 months of silence sitting inside folded pages. For a moment, I considered lying, not to protect my father, to protect everyone else, because once truth enters a room like this, it doesn't leave cleanly. But then I remembered my grandmother during the last winter before her death, sitting beside the library window wrapped in a gray blanket while snow covered the estate outside, her hands trembling slightly around a teacup. "Your father thinks control survives forever," she told me quietly. I remember looking up from the chessboard between us. "What does that mean?" She smiled sadly.
It means Richard mistakes fear for loyalty. Back in the ballroom, I finally opened the envelope completely. The sound alone felt enormous, paper unfolding beneath total silence. My father watched me carefully. No panic, not anymore. And that was worse, because he had reached the acceptance stage, the point where dangerous men stop preventing disasters and start managing them. Vanessa looked pale now, actually pale. Her perfect composure had started collapsing piece by piece ever since the word poison entered the room. "Claire," she whispered, "please." I looked at her, really looked at her, and suddenly I saw the child she used to be, 8 years old, standing outside our father's office holding a report card with shaking hands because one grade wasn't perfect. I remembered what she asked me afterward. "Did you think Dad still loves me?" At the time, I thought she was dramatic. Now, I understood something worse. Children raised around conditional affection become adults who confuse obedience with safety. "I didn't know," she said quietly. The room hurt her. That mattered, because confessions change atmosphere, especially partial ones. My father's eyes moved toward her immediately. Sharp. Warning. Vanessa noticed it, and for the first time in her life, she didn't shrink under it. "I swear to God," she continued, voice trembling now, "I didn't know about poison." There it was, the second fracture. Not denial anymore. Clarification, meaning she already knew enough to separate herself from the worst part. My father smiled faintly, a terrible expression, because it carried no humanity inside it at all. "Vanessa," he said softly, "be very careful what you imply." She stared at him in disbelief, and suddenly I realized something devastating. She had spent her entire life believing loyalty protected her from becoming disposable. Tonight, she was learning the truth. Nobody was protected. Not in this family. Arthur stepped forward again. "You involved her?" he asked quietly. My father looked irritated now. Not emotional, annoyed, like people were complicating logistics. "You're all behaving irrationally," he said. Then he looked directly at me. "You haven't even read the letter yet." The sentence landed strangely, because he was right. I hadn't. I slowly unfolded the first page. My grandmother's handwriting stared back at me immediately. Sharp cursive, perfect spacing, controlled elegance. Even her writing looked aristocratic. My throat tightened unexpectedly, not from grief, recognition. She knew this letter might become evidence. "Claire," Ethan whispered carefully, "maybe you shouldn't read it here." But my father answered before I could. "No," he said quietly. "She absolutely should." The room shifted again, because everyone heard it, the confidence, the challenge. Nobody answered him after that. Not because we were afraid to speak, because everyone suddenly understood the same thing at once. This wasn't family drama anymore. It was containment. My father stood beneath the chandelier light with one hand resting lightly against the back of a gold-trimmed chair, perfectly composed again. Too composed. That was always the danger with him. Richard Vale only became calm when he had already started planning collateral damage. The ballroom staff had stopped moving entirely now. Servers frozen beside silver trays, musicians standing silently near the stage. Even the investors looked trapped between curiosity and survival instinct. Nobody wanted to leave first, because the first person to leave a powerful man's collapse becomes visible, and visible people become targets. Ethan kept one arm slightly in front of me, protective without performing it. I noticed my father watching that carefully, evaluating him, measuring usefulness, threat, weakness. That frightened me more than the poison, because my father rarely hated people emotionally. He categorized them strategically. "Claire," my mother said softly, "what exactly was in Eleanor's letter?" Her voice shook near the end, not dramatically, just enough. I looked down at the envelope still resting in my hand. Cream paper, black seal. 3 months of silence sitting inside folded pages. For a moment, I considered lying, not to protect my father, to protect everyone else, because once truth enters a room like this, it doesn't leave cleanly. But then I remembered my grandmother during the last winter before her death, sitting beside the library window wrapped in a gray blanket while snow covered the estate outside, her hands trembling slightly around a teacup. "Your father thinks control survives forever," she told me quietly. I remember looking up from the chessboard between us. "What does that mean?" She smiled sadly. "It means Richard mistakes fear for loyalty." Back in the ballroom, I finally opened the envelope completely. The sound alone felt enormous, paper unfolding beneath total silence. My father watched me carefully. No panic, not anymore. And that was worse, because he had reached the acceptance stage, the point where dangerous men stop preventing disasters and start managing them. Vanessa looked pale now, actually pale. Her perfect composure had started collapsing piece by piece ever since the word poison entered the room. "Claire," she whispered, "please." I looked at her, really looked at her, and suddenly I saw the child she used to be, 8 years old, standing outside our father's office holding a report card with shaking hands because one grade wasn't perfect. I remembered what she asked me afterward. "Did you think Dad still loves me?" At the time, I thought she was dramatic. Now, I understood something worse. Children raised around conditional affection become adults who confuse obedience with safety. "I didn't know," she said quietly. The room hurt her. That mattered, because confessions change atmosphere, especially partial ones. My father's eyes moved toward her immediately. Sharp. Warning. Vanessa noticed it, and for the first time in her life, she didn't shrink under it. "I swear to God," she continued, voice trembling now, "I didn't know about poison." There it was, the second fracture. Not denial anymore. Clarification, meaning she already knew enough to separate herself from the worst part. My father smiled faintly, a terrible expression, because it carried no humanity inside it at all. "Vanessa," he said softly, "be very careful what you imply." She stared at him in disbelief, and suddenly I realized something devastating. She had spent her entire life believing loyalty protected her from becoming disposable. Tonight, she was learning the truth. Nobody was protected. Not in this family. Arthur stepped forward again. "You involved her?" he asked quietly. My father looked irritated now. Not emotional, annoyed, like people were complicating logistics. "You're all behaving irrationally," he said. Then he looked directly at me. "You haven't even read the letter yet." The sentence landed strangely, because he was right. I hadn't. I slowly unfolded the first page. My grandmother's handwriting stared back at me immediately. Sharp cursive, perfect spacing. Nobody answered him after that. Not because we were afraid to speak, because everyone suddenly understood the same thing at once. This wasn't family drama anymore. It was containment. My father stood beneath the chandelier light, with one hand resting lightly against the back of a gold-trimmed chair, perfectly composed again. Too composed. That was always the danger with him. Richard Vale only became calm when he had already started planning collateral damage. The ballroom staff had stopped moving entirely now. Servers frozen beside silver trays, musicians standing silently near the stage. Even the investors looked trapped between curiosity and survival instinct. Nobody wanted to leave first, because the first person to leave a powerful man's collapse becomes visible, and visible people become targets. Even kept one arm slightly in front of me, protective without performing it. I noticed my father watching that carefully, evaluating him, measuring usefulness, threat, weakness. That frightened me more than the poison, because my father rarely hated people emotionally. He categorized them strategically. "Claire," my mother said softly,
What exactly was in Eleanor's letter? Her voice shook near the end. Not dramatically, just enough. I looked down at the envelope still resting in my hand. Cream paper, black seal. 3 months of silence sitting inside folded pages. For a moment, I considered lying. Not to protect my father, to protect everyone else. Because once truth enters a room like this, it doesn't leave cleanly. But then I remembered my grandmother during the last winter before her death, sitting beside the library window wrapped in a gray blanket while snow covered the estate outside, her hands trembling slightly around a teacup. "Your father thinks control survives forever," she told me quietly. I remember looking up from the chessboard between us. "What does that mean?" She smiled sadly. "It means Richard mistakes fear for loyalty." Back in the ballroom, I finally opened the envelope completely. The sound alone felt enormous. Paper unfolding beneath total silence. My father watched me carefully. No panic, not anymore. And that was worse, because he had reached the acceptance stage, the point where dangerous men stop preventing disasters and start managing them. Vanessa looked pale now. Actually pale. Her perfect composure had started collapsing piece by piece ever since the word poison entered the room. "Claire," she whispered, "please." I looked at her, really looked at her, and suddenly I saw the child she used to be. 8 years old, standing outside our father's office, holding a report card with shaking hands because one grade wasn't perfect. I remembered what she asked me afterward. "Do you think Dad still loves me?" At the time, I thought she was dramatic. Now I understood something worse. Children raised around conditional affection become adults who confuse obedience with safety. "I didn't know," she said quietly. The room heard her. That mattered, because confessions change atmosphere, especially partial ones. My father's eyes moved toward her immediately. Sharp. Warning. Vanessa noticed it, and for the first time in her life, she didn't shrink under it. "I swear to God," she continued, voice trembling now, "I didn't know about poison." There it was. The second fracture. Not denial anymore. Clarification. Meaning she already knew enough to separate herself from the worst part. My father smiled faintly. A terrible expression, because it carried no humanity inside it at all. "Vanessa," he said softly, "be very careful what you imply." She stared at him in disbelief, and suddenly I realized something devastating. She had spent her entire life believing loyalty protected her from becoming disposable. Tonight, she was learning the truth. Nobody was protected. Not in this family. Arthur stepped forward again. "You involved her?" he asked quietly. My father looked irritated now. Not emotional, not guilty, annoyed. Like people were complicating logistics. "You're all behaving irrationally," he said. Then he looked directly at me. "You haven't even read the letter yet." The sentence landed strangely, because he was right. I hadn't. I slowly unfolded the first page. My grandmother's handwriting stared back at me immediately. Sharp cursive, perfect spacing, controlled elegance. Even her writing looked aristocratic. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Not from grief, recognition. She knew this letter might become evidence. "Claire," Ethan whispered carefully, "maybe you shouldn't read it here." But my father answered before I could. "No," he said quietly. "She absolutely should." The room shifted again, because everyone heard it. The confidence, the challenge, and suddenly I understood something terrifying. My father believed the letter still benefited him somehow, which meant either the contents were incomplete or he had already prepared for them. Neither possibility felt survivable. I began reading silently. The first lines looked harmless.
estate discussions, family concerns, health deterioration. Then halfway down the page, everything changed. My pulse didn't rise, it slowed. That always happened before shock fully arrived. Claire, my grandmother wrote, if you are reading this, then Richard has already realized I changed the inheritance structure. The ballroom disappeared around me for a moment. Not physically, mentally. Tunnel vision. Focus. Danger. I kept reading. I originally believed your father's ambition made him ruthless. I was wrong. Ruthless men still recognize limits. Ethan saw my expression change. What is it? He asked. I didn't answer, because the next line hit harder. 3 weeks ago, Richard attempted to force me to sign revised medical authorization forms while I was sedated. A sharp inhale moved through the ballroom. I hadn't realized I spoke that line aloud. My father finally moved, one step forward. Enough, he said calmly. Arthur's face went gray. Actually gray. Richard! But my father ignored him completely. I kept reading. When I refused, he informed me my death would become extremely inconvenient for several people if I continued resisting him. The room erupted instantly. Whispers, movement, voices colliding. Ethan looked horrified. My mother covered her mouth. Vanessa stared at her father like she was seeing him for the first time. And Richard Vale, he remained perfectly still, which confirmed everything. Because innocent people interrupt lies. Dangerous people study reactions. Arthur stepped forward again, low, disbelieving. She documented this? I turned another page slowly, and then I saw it. Attached behind the letter, photographs, medical documents, transfer records, signatures, evidence. Not emotional accusations, structured evidence. My father saw the realization hit me, then finally stopped pretending entirely. You should have destroyed that envelope the moment you received it, he said quietly. No warmth left now, no performance, just truth. And somehow, that was the most honest thing he'd said all night. The ballroom doors suddenly opened behind us, hard, fast. Every head turned instantly. 3 men in dark suits entered the room with the kind of posture that made conversations die automatically. Not guests, not security, something else. The man in front scanned the ballroom once before locking eyes directly with my father, then with the envelope in my hands. My stomach dropped, because I recognized him. Former federal prosecutor, now private crisis management, the kind rich people hired before arrests happened. My father had called reinforcements, and judging by the expression on the lead man's face, they weren't here to save me.
My father didn't answer immediately. That was the answer. Not words, timing. Richard Vale built empires on timing, and for the first time in my life, he had none. The ballroom stood frozen beneath golden light. Hundreds of people, millions of dollars, crystal chandeliers, political donors, board members, family friends pretending not to stare. And at the center of all of it, my father looking at me like he was calculating outcomes faster than fear could reach his face. Then he smiled again, small, controlled, dangerous. You've always had an active imagination, he said calmly. Weak, not because of the sentence, because of the delay before it. Vanessa noticed too. I saw it in the way her eyes shifted toward him, searching, measuring. Children raised around powerful people learn one thing early: confidence has rhythm, and my father had just missed a beat. I kept holding the champagne glass carefully by the stem, untouched. So drink yours first, I said softly. The room tightened instantly. My father's jaw flexed once, barely visible, but visible. Ethan looked between us slowly. Claire, I didn't look at him. Not because I wanted to ignore him, because I was afraid of what I'd see in his face. Fear, confusion, the realization that the woman he planned to marry came from a family where poison suddenly felt plausible. My father laughed lightly,
too lightly. "Do you hear yourself?" he asked calmly. I tilted my head. "Perfectly." Arthur Bennett stepped forward again. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "everyone should calm down before accusations are made." Interesting wording. Not false accusations, just accusations. The distinction mattered. Everything mattered now. Vanessa moved closer to me slowly, not emotional, strategic, like someone approaching an injured animal they weren't sure would bite. "Claire," she whispered, "please stop." I finally looked directly at her, and suddenly I saw it. Not panic, not guilt, fear for him. That changed something inside me, because guilty people protect themselves first. Loyal people protect others, especially daughters raised to believe love must be earned through obedience. "Did you know?" I asked quietly. Her expression cracked instantly, not publicly, not enough for the room, enough for me. "Know what?" she asked too quickly. There it was, deflection before clarification. My father interrupted sharply. "That's enough." The force behind the sentence snapped across the ballroom like a wire pulled too tight. Several guests looked away immediately. Nobody likes witnessing powerful men lose control in public, because it reminds them power is emotional after all. My father stepped toward me again, slower this time, measured. "Give me the glass," he said quietly. Not the envelope, the glass. And suddenly every instinct inside me went cold, because people protect threats before secrets. I smiled slightly. "No." His eyes hardened immediately. That expression, that exact expression, used to terrify me as a child. The look that came right before punishments disguised as lessons, right before silence at the dinner table, right before someone lost access to money or affection, or both. But fear changes when you finally understand the person causing it. My father wasn't angry because I embarrassed him. He was afraid because something had failed. Ethan stood slowly beside me. "Okay," he said carefully, trying to steady the room. "Someone needs to explain what's happening right now." No one answered him, because there are moments when truth becomes too large to answer politely. My mother suddenly spoke, very softly. "Richard." Everyone looked at her, including him, and what I saw in his face lasted less than a second. Warning, not concern, warning. My mother saw it too. I knew she did because her hands immediately tightened together. 32 years of marriage teaches women how to recognize danger without words. "Tell them," she whispered. The ballroom went silent again. My father stared at her carefully, and for the first time that night, he looked cornered. "You're being emotional," he said. Wrong response, completely wrong, because weak men call women emotional when facts become inconvenient. My mother actually laughed, small, broken, disbelieving. Then she looked at me, not at the envelope, not at the champagne, at me. And suddenly I realized something horrifying. She already suspected, maybe not everything, but enough. "You switched the glasses," she said quietly, to my father. No denial came. That terrified me more than denial would have. Vanessa stepped backward slightly. "Mom." "Don't," my mother whispered. One word, exhausted, years inside it. I watched my father carefully, still calm on the surface, still composed, but his eyes kept returning to the champagne glass in my hand, again and again, like he couldn't stop tracking it. That's when I knew with absolute certainty, whatever was in the glass mattered more than the inheritance, more than the envelope, more than the public humiliation. My pulse steadied completely. Training does strange things to fear. At some point, survival becomes less emotional than mathematical. Threat, distance, behavior, pattern, outcome. I slowly lowered the envelope on the table, then lifted the champagne glass slightly higher. My father moved instantly, one sharp step forward, too fast. Gasps rippled across the ballroom. "There it is," I said softly. He froze. The damage was done, because desperate movement reveals more truth than language ever can. Arthur Bennett removed his glasses slowly, a tired gesture. Old men only look tired when they finally realize the cost of loyalty. "Richard," he said quietly, "this has gone far enough." My father ignored him completely. His eyes locked onto mine. "Put the glass down." No performance left now. No charm, no warmth, only command, and underneath it, panic. I studied him carefully, then asked the question I hadn't wanted to ask until now. What exactly was supposed to happen to me tonight? Nobody breathed. Even the violinist stood motionless near the stage. My father's silence stretched too long. Vanessa looked sick now, actually sick. Ethan stepped closer beside me protectively, and that tiny movement changed my father's expression instantly, not toward me, toward Ethan. Calculation, cold, immediate. That terrified me more than anything else, because suddenly I understood the real danger, not inheritance, not reputation, witnesses. Ethan noticed it too. I saw the moment his posture changed, the moment normal family discomfort transformed into survival instinct. "Claire," he said quietly, "we're leaving." Smart man, very smart man, but my father shook his head once. "No," he said calmly, too calmly. Then he looked toward the ballroom entrance, and 4 men in black suits stepped inside simultaneously. Security, not hotel security, private, the kind my father used for problems that required silence instead of police. Around the ballroom, guests shifted uncomfortably. Some began reaching for phones. Others quietly stepped away from tables. The atmosphere had changed completely now. This wasn't wealthy family drama. This felt dangerous. My father straightened his cuffs slowly, control returning piece by piece, because now he believed numbers were back on his side. Then he looked at me with that same strategic smile again, only this time I finally understood what it really was. Not confidence, desperation wearing confidence's face. "You should have taken the toast, Claire," he said softly, and across the ballroom, Vanessa suddenly started crying.
Vanessa crying changed the room faster than shouting could have. Not loud crying, not dramatic, silent tears. The kind that appear when someone has been holding a collapsing truth together for too long. My father didn't even look at her. That was what finally broke something inside me. Not the champagne, not the security, not the lies. The fact that his own daughter was falling apart beside him, and he still cared more about control than damage. "Vanessa," I said quietly, "what did he tell you?" She shook her head immediately. Too fast. Nothing. Lie. Not polished enough. My father stepped forward again. Stop talking. But she looked at me instead, and for the first time in years, I didn't see my sister. I saw a frightened child trying desperately to protect the person hurting her. "He said it was harmless," she whispered. The ballroom reacted instantly. Tiny sounds, sharp breaths, movement, because harmless is not a word people use unless danger already exists. Ethan slowly moved in front of me, protective, instinctive. My father noticed, again, and this time he stopped pretending entirely. "You need to leave," he said coldly to Ethan. Ethan didn't move. No. Simple answer, steady voice. And strangely, that single word carried more integrity than everything my father had said all night. Richard Vale smiled faintly, the kind of smile powerful men use moments before trying to ruin someone. "You have absolutely no idea what family you're standing in front of," he said. Ethan glanced back at me once, then answered without hesitation, "No." A pause. "But I know what kind of men you are." That hit. Not publicly, personally. My father's expression flattened instantly, dangerously calm. Then he turned toward the security men near the entrance. "Escort them out." Wrong move. Completely wrong. Because the moment powerful people use force publicly, everyone finally understands fear was justified. The ballroom erupted into overlapping voices. Guests stepped backward. Phones appeared openly now. One woman whispered, "Oh my God." Arthur Bennett suddenly raised his voice. "Richard." Everything stopped. Even my father looked at him. Arthur stood perfectly straight beside the table, old hands trembling slightly at his sides. "I spent 40 years protecting this family," he said quietly. "Not emotional, exhausted. And if you take one more step tonight, I will testify myself." Silence. Absolute silence. My father stared at him in disbelief, not anger, betrayal, because narcissists never expect loyalty to expire. "What exactly would you testify to?" my father asked softly. Arthur looked at the champagne glass in my hand, then at me, and something inside him finally surrendered.
"The medication swap," he said. The room shattered instantly. Voices exploded instantly. My mother covered her mouth. Ethan turned toward me sharply. Vanessa broke completely beside the stage. And my father looked at Arthur with genuine hatred. Not performance, not image management. Hatred. I kept my voice calm. "What medication?" Arthur swallowed once, then answered the room instead of me. "Ms. Vale has a severe allergy to benzodiazepines." Every sound disappeared again. My heartbeat slowed, not sped up, slowed, because shock does strange things when the truth finally arrives exactly where you feared it would. Ethan looked horrified. "What?" Arthur continued quietly. "Combined with alcohol, the reaction could appear accidental, respiratory collapse, cardiac complications, especially under stress." My mother stumbled backward into a chair. "No." Vanessa was openly sobbing now. "I didn't know," she cried. "I swear to God I didn't know that part." My father snapped toward her instantly. "Stop talking." But it was over. Completely over. Because once fear becomes visible, truth starts multiplying on its own. I looked at my father carefully, really carefully, and suddenly I understood the terrifying part. He still believed he could survive this. That was the thing about men like Richard Vale. They don't panic when exposed. They calculate. Always calculate. "You were going to kill me," I said quietly. Not emotional, not dramatic, just true. "No." Too immediately. The room listened carefully now. Every person suddenly aware they were standing inside something criminal. "You are emotional," my father continued smoothly, "unstable. You've been under pressure for months. I was trying to prevent another scene." Another scene. Interesting phrase, because I had never caused scenes. Not once. My father noticed the reaction across the room and adjusted instantly. Classic Richard Vale. Pivot, redirect, control narrative. "She threatened the family," he said sharply. "The company, investors, everyone in this room." "There it is," Arthur whispered. My father turned toward him violently. "Be careful." Arthur actually smiled. Small, tired, free. "For the first time in my life, I think I finally am." Then he reached into his jacket and removed another envelope. The room froze again. My father went pale, actually pale. Arthur held the envelope toward me. "Your grandmother mailed 2 copies," he said. My father moved immediately. "Don't." Same word as before. Different fear. Arthur ignored him. "She knew he'd try to destroy the first." My hand stayed steady as I accepted the envelope. Heavy paper, black seal, identical. And suddenly, I remembered my grandmother's final voicemail, the one I almost deleted after her funeral. "Claire, if anything happens to me, trust patterns, not apologies." At the time, I thought she was rambling from medication. Now I understood. She had been warning me. The ballroom stood completely still as I opened the envelope slowly. My father didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Inside was a handwritten letter, and beneath it, documents, medical reports, transfer authorizations, offshore accounts, dates, signatures, and one photograph. I stared at it for a long moment. Hospital corridor, 3 months ago, my grandmother unconscious in a wheelchair, and beside her, Richard Vale speaking privately with her physician, timestamp included, 2 hours before her medication dosage changed. Ethan read over my shoulder silently, then looked at my father with absolute disgust. "What the hell is wrong with you?" My father said nothing, because predators only speak confidently while uncertainty exists. The truth removes their language. My mother slowly stood again. 32 years of loyalty breaking apart behind her eyes. "You did this to Eleanor?" she whispered. Still no answer. That was answer enough. Vanessa looked at our father like she'd never seen him before. And maybe she hadn't. Not really. Children don't see monsters clearly when survival depends on love. The first police siren sounded outside. Soft, distant, but real. Several guests turned toward the ballroom windows immediately. Arthur had called them. Of course he had. My father heard it too, and for the first time in my entire life, Richard Vale looked small, not powerless, just human, which somehow felt worse. He looked at me one final time. No charm left, no manipulation, just cold exhaustion. "You think this changes anything?" he asked quietly. I met his gaze calmly. "No," I said. A pause. "I think it reveals everything." Security stepped aside near the entrance, not for my father, for the police. And as officers entered the ballroom under the gold chandelier light, I noticed something strange. My father's untouched champagne glass still sitting alone beside the microphone, perfectly full, perfectly still, like the performance had ended before the toast ever began.